Welcome to Neptune's Lagoon. I put out a few thousand videos over the last few years trying to show you the origins of certain things, whether I'm going back into deep archaeology or into books and more common ways of thinking about this religion that we have and how we all got to where we are today. I consider this video series I'm putting out here to be one of my magnum opuses of a portion of my research. The one that has to deal with the Bible, or Genesis. In fact, what we're going to look at here is Crecganford, spelled Crecganford. That's not a relation to the man's name. That has to do with Proto-Indo-European beliefs and so on. But he actually has done a lot of research, and I've used him in a couple of my videos. About 2.5 years ago, I had this set up on my computer, and if you've been with me this long, you remember whenever that crashed, because they did an update and I lost 40 videos worth of information. Of course, that's too many tabs to have pulled up and everything, but it's the nature of the beast of research. Anyhow, about that time I had lost this, and I had 6 or 7 different files to pull up, and in research, from some of from the 1930s and before and so on. And I lost it, and when I tried to get it back, I only got a couple of them back. Found a third one from a secondary source that I didn't like as well, and really was just trying to fill it all in. Well, recently I found this Crecganford site because I was looking into ancient mythologies, and have realized that there have been these scholars now that have actually come out and shown that they know a lot of these myths that we grew up with, and a lot of these Disney movies and things like that, and what they're based on, and that it's actually not based on something that was just around the medieval ages in Germany, and all these stories that came on by these Proto-Indo-European people that had moved into the West and become the Western Europeans that we know of today. These actually go back much, much farther. In fact, the last time I believe I showed Crecganford, it was to do a verification video on the fact that some of these ancient stories, like the Wild Hunt, which is in one of my video games and has been in TV shows and things, it shows that this is a idea or concept that actually goes back some 40,000 years, that they can track it all the way back. And today we're looking at a story that tracks back some 18 to 22,000 years, but in reality they say it comes from an earlier form that can only be guessed upon. It comes back from at least 40,000 years, or the time of Cro-Magnon that we talked about in other videos, the first early European modern humans that existed on the planet. And they've been renamed to early European modern humans because once genetics got in and checked it out, and we took somebody that was 30,000 years old of Cro-Magnon and checked him, his haplogroup still exists today. So all this supposed evolution didn't really happen that much, but the evolution that we're talking about is the mental state of people, state of being able to understand and discern, trying to figure out where we all came from, how this all began, what are the stars at night. I've shown some other recent videos showing you sacred geometry and things that literally show you there were very much understanding of a lot of concepts that we think are something that are real modern. Some of them were credited to Greeks later and so on, but we find that goes back much further. Here's the example right here, and so on. But in this process, there's always been one thing hanging over, like the idea of the Bible. And I've shown you its connections in a few different videos. You can go back and look here with like the idea of Noah and the ark and so on, and he'll touch upon that a little bit too here. But once you get down deep into it, where these stories all came from. And I've been trying to lead you on to this point to show you a bunch of different things, but I waited to show you sacred geometry because I didn't want you to think that it was all built upon that, or that I was hanging everything on that pin. But then there's also things that I've shown recently as far as written in the stars. In fact, I show you where the biblical nativity story is written in the stars to this day that you can see just recently during the Christmas season. In this one, though, we're going to get into this creation myth of the Bible that most people are kind of well affirmed of and understand to a point. And you can get out your Bible and read it off that. I would suggest that you go to one of the sites that will show you some of the other Bibles before King James and so on, and what was actually said or discerned out of that. Let's get into Crecganford and have his opening statements here and start to get into this, y'all. Hopefully you can hear it good. It's being recorded on the second rate. Let's go.
Many of us will probably think we know the story of creation from the Bible's book of Genesis. But what if I told you there are details in that creation story that are easily forgotten, yet, if read carefully, will show that the story of creation in the Bible is actually a descendant of the Proto-Indo-European creation myth, a story.
Proto-Indo-Europeans we talked about quite often. Before World War II, they were called Aryans, and it's something that was well discussed, but in a modern day we've got to hide from that. But let's show about this story that we're all familiar with, about how the world and everyone and humans got created. Where does that come from?
That itself started over 6,000 years ago in the Russian steppes by the Black Sea, and not in the Near East. A number of the previous videos I've produced on this channel talk about the Proto-Indo-European creation myth, how it evolved, why it evolved, and where it can be found today in its various forms. And today I'm going to add to this with probably the most surprising revelation about the creation myth, and I'll do this by going through the first chapter of Genesis, plus some of the other texts in the Old Testament of the Bible.
Now, it's as simple as, well, the Bible talks about this is how it all began, and where are they looking at? Now we can find an essence of this in the Greeks, in the Sumerians, all through the Fertile Crescent, including Egypt, and he'll talk about that. And this all came from a common source. It's why we can find blue-eyed people and blonde-haired people and so on in pre-dynastic Egypt leading into it. I showed you recently in a Egyptologist 7 video debunk on a guy that if she used his own paper, the people that were studying it right then, which was in the 1930s, just before World War II, were very assured that they were looking at a Nordic type people that were mainly in the nobility of it all and spread through, and mixtures of those and Mediterraneans that made up the bulk of the Egyptian society that built the Great Pyramids and so on. But that same situation happened in Sumeria, in Akkad, all in the what we call Anatolia or Asia Minor today, the Greeks, the Minoans, and across the Mediterranean on both sides. Let's get into this Proto-Indo-European concept that he's showing here and where this Old Testament of the Bible had actually come from and its own self-stated origins.
Compare them to the Proto-Indo-European myth and descendants of that myth to show that the similarities are more than just coincidental. Now, one of the reasons I'm doing this is that, in my experience, very few biblical scholars understand the Proto-Indo-European myths or their migration, or indeed look outside their own sphere of reference. And very few Indo-European anthropologists really dive into the meaning behind the words of the Bible. And
that's because they've been trained not to try to look at it as being something totally separate whenever it's definitely not. I sure hope this microphone is working decent. But ever since World War II, this idea had to be left behind and shunned whenever it's all found out to have been true and come to reality. I did a couple of video series showing this, but not talking about the Bible necessarily, and putting it all together for you, and it got a pretty decent response on it too. You can look back through my work and realize that I was leading to this point, at least on a portion of what my videos were about, once I started getting into the biblical ideas and where that does all come from. Because I started off, if you'll remember, surrounding you with what the people and the police were all around, and then said, well, looky here, because people act like it's totally different whenever it really isn't.
And I feel qualified to say this because when I've challenged biblical experts, they come up short when you ask them about evidence about the origins of Genesis. They mention things like Jewish law or remnants of myths within the Bible, but there's very little evidence to actually point to that can reflect what they're saying directly. Now,
If you've been with me a while, 5 years now or so, you remember me telling a story about how whenever I tried to talk about this, I had a teacher that was willing to spend an hour with me to discuss it, was very interested, and about 4 or 5 minutes into it, I took us down a rabbit hole that they didn't want to go in, and then all of a sudden I mentioned things like this, and I had a book shut in my face, and then all of a sudden they had to go. And that type of attitude's all around whenever people don't want to realize where the actual Bible comes from in its stories. But this is the verified fact of where it comes from and where that idea comes from that's in there. Does it say it word for word? No. It does it symbology by symbology, essence by essence, and also looking at it in order, pretty much. So we can easily see a connection. A lot of researchers have been behind this, but instead of showing you the 6 different things and trying to talk about all the stuff in between and turn it into a jarbled mess, which was my original intent, I've now found Crecganford has put this out, and it gets about 85% there of what I said, and I'm just going to interrupt like I do every once in a while and get into it and explain and show you other things. And it should be good enough. You need to go to his site and check it out. If you're interested in ancient mythology, Proto-Indo-Europeans, where all this comes from, stuff like that, you can look at his videos. He's one of the people that's in the studies that can track things back tens of thousands of years. He'll explain how this happens and verify that it is pretty much a verified thing. Let's just get on into this.
Now, this doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that people I've spoken to aren't absolutely sure where the information about their understanding is within the Bible. And so, in this video, we're going to lift the cover off the surface of Genesis, the Genesis story, and show where those connections are. And to start this journey off, I'll take a look at Proto-Indo-European creation myth and explain how we know it is what we say it is, and then we'll look at Genesis and analyse that and try to understand the origins behind that story and see if there are any remnants of previous myths that can be found.
Amazingly, there easily will be seen something like that. And not to sound weird, but you remember I did a series about dragons in the Bible a couple of years ago or whatever. That's one of the things that's been erased. Take your pencil and erase it out of there and fill in another little idea that comes from the same concept. Because like he believes and a lot of other people believe, this came from a common source, And whenever they wanted to have their mythology, they definitely wanted to have the essence of that common source of where it came from. And so there still are remnants, and as I refer to it a lot of times, variations on a theme. Like when you get in an elevator and you hear elevator music, all of a sudden you go, is that Van Halen? Yeah, it's Muzak. It's a little different. It's a variation of a theme, but you can still catch it.
And their meanings. I also have to say that when I first made this journey in my own studies some years ago now and discovered what I'm about to tell you, well, what I found amazed me. And so I hope you find this of interest too, which is a great segue into asking you to like this video and subscribe to this channel if you do. It only takes a moment, it costs nothing, cheers me up, and allows even more people to see this video. That has to be.
If you're not subscribed here, please do. And then would you go check out Crecganford's site? Give him a subscribe if you like this type of information and want to learn more about it.
A good thing. So, thank you all for your support, for watching, your comments. And so without further delay, welcome to the Proto-Indo-European origins of the biblical creation story. Welcome to Crecganford.
Has to be commercial.
So let's start over 6,000 years ago, long before any words were written in the Bible. And I'll begin with the Proto-Indo-European creation myth and explain how we know this myth existed. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, I've made a number of videos on this subject, such as this one. And if you want to dive into this subject further, I will do a full in-depth video covering all the parts of the myth soon too, in one large documentary form. But let me tell you a synopsis of the story behind the myth. And it begins when academics and researchers started to recognise that a number of the creation myths across the Eurasian continent had similarities, but not just in their plot, but within the types of characters and even specific names of characters within these stories.
If you've ever studied comparative mythology or comparative religion, you'll find that this shows up over and over again. I started showing things like this in my videos, showing you, well, Inanna is Venus, that's Diana, and so on, and this keeps repeating itself from different people, showing different aspects. The strange thing is that same lady is known as the goddess of love and war and all these things. Then there's the idea of these storm gods winning over everything. I did a series on storm gods, showing you these people had this going on, and then a storm god took over, much like Marduk, and became the major god, which is what the Bible actually shows, even in its first writings and tellings of it, instead of showing you that it's just one, or monotheism as we thought of. That's why they refer to Elohim as a council and things like that.
When these stories were overlaid with data from phylogenetic research, so understanding the evolution of language and how it changes as it migrates, and with DNA analysis of human migration to understand where people migrated to, it became clear that all these creation stories from around Europe and Asia came from a single source. And that source was a culture that spoke a language called Proto-Indo-European.
Or it used to be called Aryan. It's the same thing, but we've changed that naming to try to step away from that, but still have research in the history of all mankind, because come on, people. You know, those symbols they used and so on go way, way thousands of years back. But then again, there was a reason they took that symbol from the Germanic people. I'll get into that a little bit later, but let's continue here.
And that this originated in the areas of the Russian steppes by the Black Sea, around 8,000 years ago. Now, it must be noted that Proto-Indo-European is a language, not a culture. However, the language spread, as did the beliefs of the people who spoke it, due to other people wanting to interact with them. They wanted to acquire their technology, such as farming techniques. They wanted to know how to look after cows, create wheeled transport. The people who spoke Proto-Indo-European rode horses, and therefore the non-Proto-Indo-European speakers also believed the Proto-Indo-European speakers must have had better gods because they had all these wonderful things. And
they were much more advanced than a lot of other people, had understandings that other people yearned for, and so they adopted this wholesale across the ancient world. And I've shown before in a graph, and Robert Sepper shows it in his videos, that ancient Sanskrit and all the way through to the Celts and the ancient Irish and so on, those are all languages that attach back to ancient Proto-Indo-Europeans. It all started from a common thought. You want to come up with a Tower of Babel idea of these people all had the same thought, same language and so on. This would have been what they were trying to talk about, if that's the connection.
And so that would have helped not only spread the language, but spread the beliefs with the technology and the language. And that made the Proto-Indo-European speaking people the ancestors of much of Europe and the Near East today and places beyond this. Now,
I've shown you a lot of connection videos with that too. By the way, when this goes to a part 2, it'll be in your top left-hand corner, have a similar picture and say part 2, and we'll click on that and continue on part 3, part 4, however many it goes here. I'll try to be somewhat concise, but I want this to be thorough enough so you understand in the years of research that went into it. And there are other people that have found the same thing. The beauty here is that Crecganford is putting about 85% of it together in one statement or one video. It runs about 40 minutes, and I'm going to try to add on to thicken the soup a little bit and show you the reality of it all and refer back to other videos, and you'd say, oh, here's that connection that he was talking about.
Knowing this, we can rewind time and the evolution of the stories, and then can construct the original creation myth. And we can see that there is an evolutionary path to myth from the Proto-Indo-European speakers to Genesis. And so this gives us confidence that there actually be clues in the Bible that will show traces of the source myth. And so for those of you who haven't heard it, I'll give you an overview of the original Proto-Indo-European creation myth now, and for each reference I'll use Professor David Anthony's thoughts from his book, The Horse, the Will and Language, as a template, so you have a printed version to get a reference from.
And there are many other sources that you could look at and get this information, but the one that he mentioned there can show you exactly what he's saying, as well as so many others.
Will act as an independent source, and I'll place reference to this book in the description below if you're interested in wanting a copy of that. And so the myth goes something like this. In the beginning of the cosmos, two beings were created, Manus and Gemo, meaning man and twin, respectively. And also with them was a giant cow on which they suckled for milk and strength. Manus wanted a home, wanted order, wanted to stop wandering through the cosmos, and so he killed Gemo. From his body created the sky god, the ocean god, and the earth.
And notice that this is twins. Now there's just a slight variation in your Bible where Cain and Abel were born after each other, but it's the same.
And finally, man. On the face of this story, may not seem particularly insightful, but because we understand many of the versions that are derived from this, we can understand some of the key pieces of myth within it. As these are pieces we would expect to see in descendant versions of the myth in other cultures later in the historical record.
And he's going to refer to that here shortly, but mention of Manus. And it's believed that that's where we get the idea of man from in the first place. But there's also King Menes of ancient Egypt, which everybody realizes now is a mythological creature. Not like Narmer, who has his palette and so on like that, but it's a preemptive one that they used in their starting stories. We'll talk about other things that connect to Egypt, but there's that one there. But then there's the Minoans and King Minos and that same idea. It's reflected in 4 or 5 places around here and in comparative mythology. Of course, we're thought to believe that's all pagan, and this biblical thing isn't necessarily, but who does it come from? Where's the concept come from? The whole idea. And he's showing you here.
So what are these key points? Well, they are, at the start of the myth, there was a primordial being who was a twin figure, as Yimo means twin, and he was an androgyny, so he was neither man nor woman, but both. And the primordial being was sacrificed in this version of the myth by Manus, who represents the first man. And for
This is that Cain and Abel situation. And he splits the other as a twin and ends up giving itself a male and a female counterpart. That gets echoed through, but let's just continue.
on the body parts of the now dead Yimo, Manus creates the world. Then Manus goes down to the world as a priest figure and then creates humans and teaches them about ritual sacrifice to the gods. And finally, the cow remains as it is a symbol representing the source of food and resources. So you may still be asking, how do we really know this? Well, I've spoken about this in other videos, but in summary, we have versions of this myth in Old Norse, so Scandinavia, the Roman myth of Romulus and Remus, with the Greek myths, with the Rig Veda within the Vedic or now Hindu religion, and throughout the Near East cultures in Iran, Persia, and the Mesopotamian region between the Tigris and Euphrates. In the earliest versions of the myths for these cultures, the primordial being is a twin figure, often an androgyny, with a name cognate to Yimo, and then a sacrifice is made to create the world from body parts of the primordial being.
And so it's a sacred twin. I made a video series about sacred twins and tried to show you that that was something that was pretty well known, that was well known in ancient times. It was a trope that it seems like everybody, if you use comparative religion, do, that they had these sacred twins like Romulus and Remus and Star of Rome or whatever is an easy one to see. But there are quite a few others. In fact, Jesus has a twin in that story, showing you that at the time of this, they knew those answers. And the reason that they put it together the way they did, the Old Testament and again in the New Testament, was because of these Proto-Indo-European myths that spread to humanity.
Although in some examples a city or empire is built, and we also see certain evolutionary traits of the myth where it's evolved that the primordial being stops being the one being sacrificed, and sometimes the cow is sacrificed instead. And in a few versions, even Manus is sacrificed. But the overall myth remains constant. The plot similarities, the name of the primordial being cognate with Yimo, and the twin figure, a sacrifice of the creature to make the earth, and coupled with known migrations of the Proto-Indo-European speaking populations through archaeology and DNA evidence, show that these stories are related. So now we should have confidence in the Proto-Indo-European myth of creation, how it migrated west to Scandinavia through Germania, offshoots into Greece and Italy. But the other side went eastwards towards the Indo-Iranians and then the...
So you see that it connects all to these places that I've tried to show before. These webs, as I refer to it, are pointing towards points that there's these same people here. And these people that were Proto-Indo-Europeans that are up here are actually later people that migrated all the way into over here in different waves. I'm Irish, and I find that I used to live, or the people with my same haplogroups and everything preemptive of that used to live there. Just like there's a corded ware culture, bell beaker, and so on. And these were the stories that were going along with those people through all of humanity, taking people with a mythological set. It's fantastic, people. It really is. It has really gotten us to where we are today. The spaceman heralds of mankind that lead things on and further from this point. Notice he mentions all these places, but he doesn't talk about Egypt, but he's about to just in a minute using this same picture here.
Iranians, Persians, and into Mesopotamia. And it was picked up by the Sumerians and then the Babylonians. And what we hope to see now is that the writers of the Bible, who are living in close proximity to the Babylonians, then picked up this story from the Babylonians to help create Genesis, the creation story in Genesis.
And I've shown a lot of times that the ancient Sumerians have that story that's cognate with the other one. This idea, it doesn't make any sense that a woman grew from a rib and ate from a magic tree because a talking snake told her to. Well, you have to go pretty deep down a rabbit hole to find out where that all comes from and have an idea and then realize the people's beliefs at that time. It's kind of like a primordial science, but it was looking at it as an allegory and a story, never supposed to be taken as literal, but in ways and of its essence were. So you're supposed to get a belief of how this all came to be in the first place. Are you following me? Good. Again, if it goes to part 2, it's in your top left-hand corner. That probably won't be too much longer. I'll find a good stopping point if I can.
Understanding this could have happened, we need to understand a few things about the region where the Bible was written and where Babylon was, in effect, where Jewish religion was created, and then we can look at an overview of the biblical creation myth. As whilst most people who haven't read the Bible think that God said let there be light and then created Adam from a handful of earth before creating Eve from Adam, the story of the creation myth in Genesis is actually more detailed and more complex than that. And there's subtle yet critical wording within. And these details need to be understood to really see where the Genesis story originated from. So let's look at a map of the region of the Near East from around what it would look like 3,500 years ago. I'll put this up now. You can see how it's shaped politically and culturally. The region of the Near East is also known as the Fertile Crescent, due to the freshwater sources enhancing the ability to farm. And I'll highlight the Fertile Crescent in green on the map to go through.
And I'll spread it out a little bit to show you that it's going off into Egypt here. He's going to talk about that shortly.
Through the Nile in Egypt, through what is now Israel but was referred to as Canaan back then, and then it went round and down through the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the area between these two rivers is known as Mesopotamia. Now,
and the Sumerians called their land that was fertilized by that as Eden, and we know that as being the primordial garden that started everything. We look at that and look at Sumeria as being the culture and civilization that started it all, even preemptive to the Egyptians and so on. But this whole Fertile Crescent was romping and got going fairly well right behind each other. There were feats upon feats that they learned from each other. I've shown you a lot of connections to the ancient Mesopotamians, to the ancient Egyptians, and so on. But when we look at this as a common people that came down from places like Göbekli Tepe, dating back to the end of the last ice age and so on, with these tales, and they split off this way and that and so on, and even went into India and all across the Western world too. We start to make connections with what's going on. Again, this is Egypt that he's showing here, and its connections to this Proto-Indo-European myth and how it got started there.
If I show Egypt's empire, you see that Egypt actually controlled the area that was Canaan around 3,500 years ago. And this is interesting, as it means that the cities considered the birthplace of Judaism were under Egyptian control. And there may be...
Now, man, I keep interrupting at the wrong spot, but I've shown you other videos about this too. During this whole time here, this whole area was controlled by one people or another. There was not some sacred island like we have in our mentality about the way this worked out in any way, shape, or form, and extreme influences from both sides, down the Tigris and Euphrates, up and backwards from Egypt and going on. Although in Egypt it stagnated pretty much at that point. Going east, it went all the way through India and the Buddhist type people and so on that I've made other connections to. And then of course everything north of here would have been looked at as that. People look at this Noah story like Noah's kids could have somehow been different races of people. That makes no sense whatsoever. That's a modern pandering idea whenever this is just the mythology of these ancient people known nowadays as Proto-Indo-Europeans that herald the mythology that we based our society around that led the world to where it is now. Let's continue.
Evidence of the influence of this too within the stories of the Old Testament and Genesis. And to the east we have the area of the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, which were once part of the Sumerian Empire before 3,500 years ago, and which would eventually become the Babylonian Empire. Within this region, water was important. The rivers were essential for farming and irrigation, but the sea was considered challenging. These cultures were not actual sailors, and so there was an underlying concern about the sea.
Now I've made a couple of other videos showing you, even though he said that they weren't really sailors. No, well, they weren't going around the world and everybody doing that, but they were a sailing group. In fact, I made a video series showing you that there are cultures in the Aegean, in the Mediterranean, that went out to islands and lived there back and forth multiple times, and the only way they could get there is from having some type of boating or raft or whatever you want to come up with. But it shows you that they had that going on at 165,000 BC. So the idea of boating was shunned in humanity as we were coming up through in all the Middle Ages, and people want to believe that Noah was the first boat and the second one was the Mayflower or something strange whenever we find that these ancient Phoenicians were going all over the place. I've made a series showing you that there's a lot of stuff the Phoenicians had taken to far, far and distant lands. Who are the Phoenicians? They're really looked at as being part of the Canaanites that are right there in that area. Where's Israel at? It doesn't exist at this point. But Israel used to be the ancient Phoenician word for the wandering star we call Saturn today. It's the reason we have Saturday. Let's continue.
And this too could be reflected in stories. Now, the story of the Proto-European myth in this region starts with an archaeological find within the region where a number of tablets had on them a story. That story we now know as the Enuma Elish, and that means well on high. And this story was a creation myth told by the Sumerians and then the Babylonians. And we know their creation myth was influenced by the Proto-Indo-Europeans. And in that video, I will explain the Enuma Elish, read it, and talk about some of the subjects in it. So you may want to watch that first before you can understand what's going on here in real detail. But I'll sum.
You can go to Crecganford's site and see this and look and give you more depth of understanding of this culture, where it came from, where it did. And I'd have to note that it's still done with a little bit of kid gloves because of the modern connotations that are still thrown upon this from what happened in World War II. But some people are studying actual history of the world. They're just going to have to get over it and get beyond it. Well, here we find they get beyond the story of the Bible, and they see that it's reflected in the ancient Sumerian tales and others all through the Fertile Crescent, including Egypt and so on, that these people were heralded and indefinitely in touch, if not led in nobility by these people.
Was the Babylonian version of the creation myth of the Enuma Elish here for those who haven't seen the video. But it is a real synopsis. And it starts in a cosmos of water with a male freshwater primordial being of Apsu and a female saltwater primordial being of Tiamat. And Tiamat is often referred to as a dragon.
Now I've shown you in my video game, there's this 5-headed dragon, Tiamat. It's been in Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. Well, what's it been in? That comes from mythology. How far does that go back? That goes back a long, long time. Although the first stories that show this actually refer to it somewhat like a cow. And then it gets twisted, possibly from them finding dinosaur bones and so on, and it gets twisted into an idea of dragons. We still have the dragon mythology quite fervent and quite recent, and it still keeps popping itself up every once in a while, doesn't it? Well, I did a video series showing you there are dragons in the Bible. They're kind of hidden somewhat, but bam, there it is. He breathes fire and smoke. He does all these things. He flies. He's got wings. You start adding these things up. If I was to describe something like that and then said draw a picture, you'd be drawing a picture of a dragon. Anyhow, Tiamat is with the idea of creation. She helps put the vault up above the earth. Later, it gets changed again, and Enlil comes in, and then later it gets changed again into Marduk, which he's going to talk about, which takes over the idea of killing Tiamat in the original place and says that he did it, and now he becomes the major god. He's the storm god. He's the major god, just like Zeus, just like others, in fact, just like in your Bible, which at this point isn't really a monotheistic type of look. It's more of a hedonistic, but anyhow.
These represent the twin primordial being of creation as they come together in one large form of water, and after an argument, one of Apsu and Tiamat's children kills Apsu, and then another of their descendants, called Marduk, then kills Tiamat by sending magical wind into her mouth, meaning she cannot close it, and then he can fire an arrow down into her stomach and splits her in two. From her body he makes the world, and from the blood of her ally, Kingu, Marduk then makes man, from what is specifically called a savage man, who shall work.
So there's blood of a god used to create mankind. This is the idea, and I've shown and told you before how this is the way that people realize that they're so much more advanced than these others, that what could be it? It's this sons of God concept. These people that were chosen apparently before they're even into this time here, they're waking up to the fact that they had been chosen to herald civilization and to lead us to the point where we've got computers and spaceships and things like that now. It's quite an amazing journey to look at, people. It really is. It's an important part of humanity. It's the reason we are where we are at.
On earth for the benefit of the gods, and this represents man sacrificing the primordial being to make the world before creating man, and again aligning to the Proto-Indo-European creation myth.
And building something like a Titanomachy that you see in the Greeks, where they have these ancient creatures and these big giant things. Those got killed off, a triumph by a next, and so on, leading by a storm god, who's the only one when everybody else is scared that takes over, and he ends up becoming the leader of the gods. That's what the Bible one is too. It's just that they start dropping it off. Amazingly, they said they had to keep it the way it was, and so you can still find expressions like hour, talking about the Elohim of the Bible and how this was a sacred council of who. Well, now they try to twist that into an idea that it was just the angels. Well, that they relegated all the lesser gods into being just angels. Can you find winged people like that in ancient cultures and stuff? Yes. Are they associated with heaven and the gods and everything? Yes. Yeah, it's just all right there. But let's take this creation myth one step farther with it, as he's showing here. And in a minute, we're going to go to part 2.
Knowing this, it will help us as we go through the biblical creation myth. So, in summary, what we're saying is, by looking at a map of the area, that the book of Genesis, found in the Jewish Torah and the Old Testament, possibly had two major influences, the Babylonians and the Egyptians, who controlled the region between them. And so we might expect to see influence from these cultures within the Old Testament, and therefore possibly Genesis.
In fact, bingo.
And this is exactly what has happened. There are actually two creation myths within Genesis, known in Hebrew as Aleph and Bet, or versions A and B, Alpha and Beta to us. Now, with the Egyptian story, that is labelled A, and is in chapter 2 of Genesis predominantly, and the Babylonian story is B, and is predominantly in chapter 1. And these two stories are, because they're written next to each other, it is very clear they deliver a number of contradictions. And so this also confuses those who are unaware if they try and call the plot of creation, as because those two stories, it's quite easy to mix up the different creation myths. Now,
And a lot of scholars have noticed this from a long time ago. In Genesis 1, there's something. In Genesis 2, there's a separate story going on. Things happen in a different order, and so on. And so whenever they start off and tell you that the Bible is an infallible, this, that, and the other, and da-da-da, and you go, okay, let me read it. And you get a couple of pages in, and you go, well, that's not the same as the thing I just read last page. It starts happening that quick. But then there's a woman who grows from a rib and eats from a magic tree because the talking snake tells her to. And you're saying, okay, well, I can get past that. That really happened, but what's these contradictions? What? You know, talking creatures like that are what are significant and a real symbol of being a myth. Such as talking donkeys like Shrek. That's found in your Bible too. I did an old video about that too because people are like, well, those are all the magical creatures. Where does this talking donkey thing come from? Well, you wouldn't believe it, but it's in your Bible. Yeah, Balaam's talking donkey. Anyhow, you take these two stories and try to weave them together, and it didn't weave together correctly, and they just went ahead and left it that way. They weren't willing to go with one or the other. They were trying to take from both, being trapped in the middle of these people. But believe it or not, the ancient Canaanites had their own thing going on too. Like a lot of the religions did coming into this time, they dropped it to try to make another one, especially after the captivity in Babylon. Perhaps showed them something. There were other people too, like later the Greeks and the Romans, who tried to drop it and go back to this idea because they liked it better than their stories, which contained rape and different ideas like that because, well, honestly, that's kind of what's written in the star, and that's kind of the look at the older ways, and people were trying to find something to inspire them, and that's not going to do it. It's really that simple. Let's continue here, and then we'll go to part 2. It'll be in your top left-hand corner.
knowing there are two stories, in a way, can make it simple to pull out the Babylonian one, as there is this difference. And then we can check if that still contains key myth details recognised from the Babylonian creation myth proper, and then we should not only be able to connect it with the enumerated leash, but potentially also with the Proto-Indo-European creation myth. And so the only way to prove this is to, in effect, take apart the first chapter of Genesis. But before we do that, we have to decide on the version of Genesis to look at, as there are tens of versions of the Bible, there may be even more than that. Such as probably the King James Version is the most popular. But what we really want is a reference to a Bible that is not subject to all the modern interpretations and influences. And so I'm going to use wording of Genesis from the Torah. For me, I specifically got that from a version which is from the Jewish Publishing Society's Torah commentary on Genesis. So let's jump into Genesis and see what's going on.
Well, let's go ahead and go to part 2 here. This will give you a chance to get a drink and sum up in your mind what's going on so far, and then we'll show separations. He starts off and puts together Egypt, shows you it there, shows you it again in the Sumerians, shows you the connections, and starts whipping it together, and then shows its ultimate origin, which were the Proto-Indo-Europeans we've talked about so much on the channel, because it's really that thing in life that's really hidden. Why did Western Europeans get behind this and make it what it is today? Because it's their ancient stories from way back when. It resonates with them because it's their mythology. That makes sense? We're going to go to part 2, and it's going to be up here in your top left-hand corner right here. And click on it, and we'll go to part 2, but try to come back and put down a comment on what you've seen so far, understood, and if this helped you out and this showed you something that you never knew. See you in part 2.